Imagine a world where your money literally just stops working.
Yeah, it just completely freezes up.
Right, like you try to buy a plane ticket or, I don't know, a steak at the grocery store, and your card gets declined simply because an algorithm decided you've hit your monthly emergency limit.
It sounds totally crazy, like a dystopian sci-fi novel.
Exactly. But the wild thing is, the blueprints for that exact reality are actively being debated by policymakers today. Right now. Welcome to the Deep Dive. We are really thrilled to have you with us because today we're looking at an incredible stack of sources that gets right to the heart of how these ideas quietly move from, radical theory into our everyday lives.
And we've got some fascinating text to get through.
We really do. We are diving into a modern essay critiquing UK technocratic mandates, and then we're unpacking excerpts from John Stuart Mill's foundational 1859 text on liberty. Plus, we're breaking down an academic paper titled The Educated Citizen, which explores classical liberalism and economic literacy.
It is a dense stack, but so relevant.
Our mission here is to explore how manufactured consensus and media illiteracy challenge your daily life. We're going to examine this growing tension between modern expert-led mandates and our historical struggle for individual liberty.
Right, and before we get too far down that road, it is crucial to provide some context for you, the listener.
Yeah, definitely.
The source material we are unpacking today touches on highly charged, very specific political examples from the UK. These are topics that cross both left-wing and right-wing political lines.
So we're talking ultra-low emission zones, 15-minute cities, climate emergency declarations, really hot-button stuff.
Exactly. And we want to make it explicitly clear that our purpose on this deep dive is not to take sides. We're not endorsing any of these specific political viewpoints.
Nope, not at all.
We are strictly here to impartially analyze the arguments exactly as they are presented in the original texts. We're just using them as lenses to explore much broader, timeless philosophical themes.
Okay, let's unpack this. Think about your own life for a second. How often do you accept a headline or an AI-generated summary just because the experts say so?
I mean, we all do it.
We do. But the modern essay in our stack suggests we are passively consuming media to a dangerous degree. And this brings us to a philosophical danger that John Stuart Mill warned about over a century and a half ago.
Right. So Mill introduced this concept of the tyranny of the majority. And when we hear the word tyranny, we immediately picture a dictator, right? Or a monarch, or really oppressive laws.
Somebody ruling with an iron fist.
Exactly. But Mill argued that society itself can be a tyrant, and often it's a much more formidable one.
At least it's invisible.
Yes. This tyranny operates through social coercion. It subtly dictates what is acceptable to think and say. And in Mill's words, it enslaves the soul itself by preventing the formation of true individuality.
That is a heavy phrase. Enslaves the soul.
It really is. One of the most powerful concepts from his text is the warning that even if a prevailing opinion is completely true, if it is not fully, frequently, and fearlessly discussed, it will be held as a dead dogma.
Wait, I have to push back on that a little bit.
Sure, go ahead.
Aren't experts supposed to know better than the average person? I mean, if a doctor tells me to take antibiotics for a severe infection, I don't sit there and demand a full, frequent, and fearless debate while I have a 103-degree fever.
Right, you just take the medicine.
I just take the medicine. So why shouldn't we trust expert consensus on complex societal issues? To use a driving analogy, it feels like we are supposed to blindly trust the GPS because the satellite built by aerospace engineers told us to turn. Even if we can, literally see a lake right in front of us.
What's fascinating here is how the modern essay in our sources connects Mill's 19th century warning directly to that modern feeling of blind trust.
How so?
The author argues that modern media illiteracy isn't an inability to read the words on a page. Rather, it is the uncritical acceptance of a priori assumptions.
A priori meaning things we just assume to be true before looking at any underlying evidence.
Exactly. And it's also the vulnerability to post hoc fallacies.
Which is assuming that because one thing happened after another, the first thing must have caused the second.
You got it. When we treat experts as infallible, we turn their conclusions into that dead dogma Mill warned about. We just stop analyzing the mechanics of their claims.
And the sources point to a glaring modern example of this in the 10th section of the essay, AI-Driven Information Slop.
Right, the slop. Yeah.
When you or I rely on low-quality, expert-vetted AI summaries to give us the answer to a complex political question, we are being fed a manufactured consensus.
Because the AI's training data has already decided what the accepted truth is behind the scenes.
Exactly. That effectively insulates the tyranny of the majority from any genuine scrutiny. You weren't participating in a debate. You were just being handed a sanitized, pre-approved conclusion.
Unquestioned consensus is the psychological tool used to manufacture compliance. But how do authorities politically justify bypassing your individual reason to enforce that compliance?
By declaring an emergency.
Right. According to the texts, they do it by declaring an emergency.
Aye.
And understand why that matters, we have to look at another foundational concept from Mill, the harm principle.
The harm principle is this idea that the only legitimate justification for society to coerce an individual, either legally or socially, is self-protection or preventing harm to others.
Yes, Mill was totally uncompromising on this. Over your own body and your own mind, you as the individual are sovereign.
So under normal circumstances, the state has no philosophical grounding to tell you what to eat or how to heat your home just because they think they know what is best for you.
Right. However, our modern source points out a crucial rhetorical shift. Notice the transition in public discourse over the last decade, from climate change to climate emergency or even global boiling.
Oh, wow. Yeah, the language has definitely escalated.
It has. And the author argues that by declaring a permanent existential emergency, the state effectively bypasses the harm principle entirely.
Because the stakes are suddenly life or death for everybody.
Exactly. If the threat is framed as total and existential, then the argument becomes that your individual sovereignty must be surrendered to the collective to prevent this massive world-ending harm.
And the essay lists some very specific UK examples of how this emergency framing erodes autonomy on a daily basis. Let's look at the meat-free social stigma and the push for methane-inhibiting cattle feed, like Bovaer.
Right. The cattle feed mandate.
The source argues that authorities and the media treat cows as simple methane machines, but this relies on an a priori assumption that completely ignores the complex science.
This is where we get into the difference between a stock gas and a flow gas. The text highlights this through the UK's reliance on the GWP 100 metric.
That's global warming potential over 100 years.
Right, and the author calls this metric pseudoscience because it treats biological methane like carbon dioxide.
Let's break that down for a second. Think of CO2 as a bathtub with a plugged drain. Every drop of water you add stays there, accumulating. That's a stock gas.
Right.
But biological methane from a naturally grazing cow is like a river. It flows in, but it flows right back out as it naturally breaks down in the atmosphere after about 12 years. It's part of a cyclical flow.
The bathtub versus the river. That's a great way to picture it.
Yeah, but by framing everything as binary emissions emergency using the bathtub model, the nuance is totally lost. We end up with this intense social coercion.
And not necessarily laws yet.
Right, not laws, but rules in schools and public institutions mandating meat-free days, pushing a prevailing opinion without ever holding a democratic vote.
And it's not just our diets being policed by this emergency framing. It extends into the very walls of our homes. The text points out how this exact same binary thinking is being used to push heat pump mandates.
Oh man, this one really illustrates the disconnect between expert mandates and physical reality.
It really does.
There's an aggressive media astroturfing campaign framing heat pumps as the absolute only solution to the energy crisis, but they completely ignore the thermodynamics of older UK housing stock.
Which is largely old brick houses.
Yes. Heat pumps supply a very low, steady heat. If you put them in a...
Exactly. Yeah. The modern technocratic state reduces incredibly complex physical and social realities into simple binaries to force compliance. You are either with the clean consensus or you are a toxic threat to society.
So what does this all mean for the working class? I mean, how do these binaries actually impact the average person just trying to commute to their job?
Well, the author of the essay uses the expansion of ultra-low emission zones, or ULEZ, in London as the prime example of this trade-off.
Okay.
The proponents of ULEZ cite thousands of deaths annually to justify charging people to drive older cars. But the source points out that this figure is heavily misunderstood.
Because it relies on statistical modeling of equivalent deaths, not actual clinical death certificates.
Right, and that is a massive distinction.
Equivalent deaths don't mean a doctor wrote air pollution on an actual death certificate. It's a statistical model that estimates how many individual days or hours of life were lost across a population of millions of people.
Yeah.
And then it bundles those lost fractions of time into imaginary equivalent people.
But the media reports it as if thousands of actual individuals dropped dead in the street from breathing the air.
Exactly. The media presents a strict binary clean air versus toxic lungs. And if you are media illiterate, you just accept that a priori assumption. You don't scrutinize the data grain.
You just take it as fact.
Yeah. And more importantly, the essay argues that this binary completely silences the massive trade-off regarding the liberty of working-class people. Their freedom of movement, their ability to afford to travel to work is sacrificed to this modeled consensus.
And questioning it gets you labeled as selfish.
Yep.
That labeling is the tyranny of the majority actively silencing dissent. The text also applies this to the concept of 15-minute cities, where urban planning is framed purely as local convenience.
Right, everything is just 15 minutes away. Sounds great, right?
It does sound great.
Yeah.
But the social tyranny kicks in when any scrutiny of the movement tracking sensors or low-traffic neighborhoods is instantly shut down and labeled as a fringe conspiracy theory.
And that brings us to the ultimate tool for enforcing these clean versus toxic binaries, the money in your pocket.
The digital money.
Yes, the source discusses the Bank of England's push for central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs, specifically Britcoin. Now, I can hear someone arguing against the author here.
What would they say?
Isn't a digital currency just like a digital gift card or Apple Pay? We already use digital money every single day. Why is the author framing this as some massive threat to liberty?
Well, it is like a gift card. Imagine if the store that issued the gift card could reprogram it while it's in your pocket.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Apple Pay just moves your existing money from point A to point B.
Yeah.
A central bank digital currency is fundamentally different because of its technical capacity for programmable restrictions.
Programmable restrictions.
Exactly. The source outlines this as the ultimate slippery slip. That's a term the author uses to describe the slippery slope of expert-led mandates.
So it starts as a convenience.
Yes. Which is always the a priori assumption of progress, right?
Yeah.
It's convenient. The experts claim it won't lead to social credit-style restrictions.
But the tech is there.
But once the technology exists to program how and where your money can be spent, perhaps tying your wallet to your carbon footprint or your compliance with the latest emergency mandate, the door is wide open for total control.
So a programmable currency could automatically decline your purchase of fuel if you've exceeded your monthly equivalent carbon allowance.
Precisely. The public is asked to accept the experts' infallibility, ignoring the historical reality that power, once granted, is rarely relinquished.
Here's where it gets really interesting. If this centralized, expert-led approach is so fundamentally flawed, and if it constantly strips away individual liberty in the name of safety or convenience, what is the alternative?
Right. How do we actually run a society?
Yeah, how does society actually function if we don't have a room full of experts planning everything from the top down?
For that, we turn to the final source in our stack, the academic paper, The Educated Citizen. This paper introduces the classical liberal tradition, specifically highlighting the economic insights of Friedrich Hayek and Ludwig von Mises.
Two heavy hitters.
Absolutely. They diagnosed exactly why central planning fails, regardless of how smart the experts are. They called it the economic calculation problem.
Mises argued that central planners suffer from a pretense of knowledge. They sit in a room with their supercomputers and their data, but they cannot possibly know the relative value of different resources or what uses are most productive without the price signals generated by a free market.
They're flying blind, essentially.
Completely blind.
And Hayek expanded on this beautifully with the concept of dispersed knowledge. Hayek pointed out that knowledge in a society isn't just objective data that can be fed into an AI model.
It's not just a spreadsheet.
No, knowledge is subjective. It's highly local, it's tacit, and it is constantly changing.
Like the local mechanic fixing a car in a local garage. He knows something about the immediate supply of steel or the specific needs of his community that a bureaucrat sitting in a capital city simply cannot know.
Right. No single mind can hold all that information.
And when you leave people alone to make their own choices, trading voluntarily based on their own local knowledge, you get what Hayek called spontaneous order.
Spontaneous order.
It's an incredibly complex, highly efficient social and economic order that emerges organically. Millions of individuals pursuing their own goals, coordinating without any central planner telling them what to do. It fosters creativity precisely because it limits arbitrary power.
But the academic paper raises a critical dilemma. If spontaneous order is so efficient, and if central planning so consistently threatens our liberty and prosperity, why are modern societies so willing to give up that order?
That is the million-dollar question.
Why are we so eager to embrace the slippery slip of technocratic mandates? The source argues that this vulnerability is the direct result of a profound failure in civic formation. specifically a crisis in our education system.
The paper notes that modern education has largely abandoned the teaching of moral character. Instead, it focuses heavily on vocational skills and something called neoliberal agency.
Neoliberal agency. Basically, treating you and me purely as consumers in a marketplace, trying to maximize our personal utility.
Right. We are taught how to earn and spend, but that strips away the moral framework needed to handle the heavy responsibilities of liberty.
Because liberty isn't just the ability to buy whatever you want. It requires rigorous self-governance. The source advocates for a return to Aristotelian virtue ethics and natural law.
So, practically speaking, what does that mean?
In practical terms, this means an education system that prioritizes teaching individuals the habitual practice of virtues like prudence.
Prudence being the ability to govern and discipline oneself by the use of reason.
Yes. Along with courage and temperance. It's about answering the question, what kind of person should I be? Rather than just, what can I acquire?
Because if you don't have that internal moral scaffolding, liberty just becomes a license for unrestrained self-interest.
Right.
And that breaks down the social trust required for spontaneous order to function. You need a populace that is economically literate enough to reject top-down collectivism and morally grounded enough to actually handle the freedom that Mill championed.
And this brings us full circle to the mechanisms of manufactured consensus. We've seen how unquestioned expert consensus acts as a tyranny of the majority, turning science into dead dogma.
Yeah.
We've explored how declaring an existential emergency rhetorically bypasses the harm principle, forcing you to surrender personal autonomy over everyday choices like what you eat or how you heat your home.
We broke down the mechanics of technocratic mandates, where things like ULEZ models and programmable digital currencies hide massive trade-offs behind simple data-driven binaries. And finally, we explored the classical liberal antidote, trusting in the spontaneous order of dispersed knowledge and fixing our educational crisis by returning to virtue ethics and character formation.
This raises an important question for you to consider as you go about your week. How much of your own reasoning have you inadvertently outsourced to authorities or to algorithms?
It's a tough question to ask yourself.
It is. When you read a headline declaring a new emergency, or hear a policy framed as a simple binary of clean versus toxic, take a moment to look for the a priori assumptions. Look for the hidden trade-offs.
Yes, look at the whole picture.
The health of a free society depends on your willingness to engage in the full, frequent, and fearless discussion that prevents truth from becoming dead dogma.
And to leave you with one final thought, we talked at the beginning about blindly following the GPS into the lake. But what happens if the GPS isn't just giving us bad directions, but actually redefining the language we use to navigate reality? If our reliance on AI summaries and expert consensus continues to grow, and our education system continues to drift away from teaching critical moral character, will we eventually lose the very vocabulary needed to express individual dissent?
That's a chilling thought.
Could we end up in a society where we don't even know how to ask for our liberty back, simply because the algorithms never taught us the words? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep learning, and we will catch you next time.